Will Goldstein here, thekingscourt.com. You can always check out my music and my books that I do and digital albums that I do at thekingscourt.com. And I'm continuing here with this series, C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, a great book. The title of this video, I'm just going to use his title here, The Reality of the Law. So he starts out by sort of like revisiting what he had some statements that he made earlier. There are two odd things about the human race, and what he says is we are haunted by the idea of a behavior that we ought to practice. And notice that he used the word haunted, because we don't put what we know we should. It's a sort of a life with fair play and acting in a decent way with a morality. And again, he calls that the law of human nature or the law of nature. But like I said, in fact, none of us really fully do that. And he's really not interested at all, he says, in presenting blame. That's not the point of the whole issue. He's just trying to find out the truth about this whole thing. And, so there is an idea of being imperfect that we are, and that has consequences. That's what he's interested in, the truth, the reality that there is an idea of being perfect. We're not perfect. We're imperfect. We feel that we ought to be perfect, and there's consequences to that concept. So the law of nature is applied. There's laws in nature that apply to things like the stones or trees, and this really only means, according to Lewis, what nature really actually does. They're just following the laws of nature. And you can start to see where he's veering off here, because in the law of decent behavior, it doesn't mean what in human beings actually do. It means what they ought to do. So that's the problem. There's a difference between those two laws. So many people don't obey the laws of decent behavior at all, or hardly, and none obey it completely. So the law of gravity, for example, tells stones what to do when you drop them. Okay, the law of human nature tells us what we ought to do, but we don't do it. So, then he gives some examples. He says, I'm angry when a man tries to trip me up, or even if he doesn't succeed, because his intentions are to trip me up. And then he gives some other examples. He said a traitor on the other side, I suppose in war, may be very useful to the people who are using him, and they may pay him. They may even pay him well, but they regard him as human venom. So he's given examples. So decent behavior doesn't always pay. In fact, sometimes being not decent, as the example he just gave, pays big time. Okay, but decent behavior, sometimes there's a sacrifice that has to be made for decent behavior. For example, if taking a test, it's easy to cheat, but the decent thing to do is not to cheat. Some guy might want to sleep with some girl, if he's a Christian, because he's feels that way towards her. But if he's a Christian, maybe he controls himself and doesn't do what his intentions are. So, unless he marries her. Decent conduct, then, means basically what pays, not necessarily for a particular person, but for the human race in general. So it's something that everybody wins in. That's decent behavior. And you can't really have safety or happiness in a society where people don't play fair. So if you're always dealing with somebody who's trying to cheat you and rip you off, take advantage of you, it's a constant battle. True happiness in a society is where people inwardly do play fair, and they do have a moral conscience. Okay, so, and that's what he just says. So you have safety only comes from individual classes and nations and people groups that are being honest and fair and kind to each other. So then he says men ought to be unselfish and men ought to be fair. And he's not saying that men, he says, not that men are all unselfish or not that they like being unselfish, but they ought to be unselfish. So the important word in there is ought. So he kind of wraps this up with the rule of right and wrong. And he's saying it must really be there. It must be a real thing that exists. And that's the point he's making. It exists. Whether we like it or not, whether we believe it or not, it's a truth, it's a reality. It exists. It is really there, are his words. There is something above, and if that's the case, and there is something above God and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior, there's a real law in which none of us made that law. We didn't make that law, but it's pressing on us.